I mean, it was unthinkable that a politician 50 years ago like Barack Obama would have at least 5 different Social Security numbers, which he did. And yet to question that, they smear you as a birther. And that was one of the things that Donald Trump first got in trouble about, because he did note that there were questions around his birth. But we can't even talk about that now, because they shout you down. And that's what the left does at this point. It's all about name calling and killing the messenger.
Hey friends, before we begin this one, I want to let you know it's brought to you in part by our friends at Rugged Reserves. Their Patriot flashlight is a must-have, and stay tuned for a 25% off promo code. Just think about it. When you pack your bug-out bag, you want everything from a glass-breaking hammer to a cell phone charger to a flashlight to a wire cutter and a compass. Well, you can get all of that and more with the Patriot flashlight. Light up the darkness with 500 lumens that can be seen miles away. And there's an emergency strobe with 4 unique lighting modes. And now the Patriot flashlight even has an emergency siren. And you know what the best part is? It's solar powered. So this bad boy will always have power when you need it most. It really does make the perfect Christmas gift. Get one for your bug out bag, for your car, for your wife's car, for your home. Just visit patriotflashlight.com. I'll leave the link below this video. And while supplies last, use promo code SGT25 to save 25% off your purchase. That's patriotflashlight.com. The link is below this video. Hey friends, God bless you. Thanks so much for tuning in on this Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd, 2018, which also happens to be the anniversary of our beloved president's assassination at the hands of the deep state. On November 22nd, 1963, shortly after noon in Dealey Plaza, shots rang out as the deep state took another president of the people. I have back on the show Donald Jeffries. He's the author of Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups in American politics. And we are going to pin this date and remind people that the same powers that took John F. Kennedy's life are the same powers that are trying to topple our sitting president today. Donald Jeffries, thanks for coming back.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Sean.
Well, your thoughts on this Thanksgiving Day, and it just happens to align with the anniversary of JFK's assassination.
Well, it's been 55 years now, and I've been studying this since when I was a teenager in the mid-1970s. So, I went down to the National Archives then. I held the alleged murder weapon, the ridiculous man liquor cannon on my hand, held the magic bullet, saw his clothing. I've talked to everybody about it, what witnesses were left, and written extensively about it. So I think it's really the as I call it in my book, the mother of all conspiracies, at least for the modern era. And I think so much, we have such a domino effect on any of these kind of cover-ups, conspiracies, where I believe that a revelation where they admitted the truth about the JFK assassination would have a domino effect on the MLK assassination, RFK assassination, everything that happened in the 60s and into the 70s, and down to the JFK Jr., I believe, assassination, which we're going to talk about further. But I think any of these things that you could go at the other end, where if you expose the truth about, say, something like the murder of Seth Rich, it would have a reverse domino effect. I think the dominoes will fall backwards and start exposing some of these past crimes and cover-ups.
Yeah, you mentioned I'm going to call it the assassination of John F. Kennedy Jr. We can talk about that in a second. That's in Chapter 7, and you begin Chapter 7 with this quote from his father, President John F. Kennedy: "For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy." Never has that been more clear than it is today, Donald. And you mentioned the mother of all conspiracies, Chapter 1, the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I want to point folks to this book. Go get it, guys. Hidden History. You can find it on Amazon. It's by Donald Jeffries. Get it as gifts. Give it out over Christmas. It'll wake people up. Chapter 6, The Clinton Years, Conspiracy Central. The reason I wanted to bring that to your attention, Donald, is I want your thoughts on this. On Wednesday, House GOP working with whistleblowers in Clinton Foundation probe. Quote, "There's a great possibility of significant improper activity that's happening in and around the Clinton Foundation," end quote. Boy, is CNN concerned about this. They call it a witch hunt. They say that the president is just targeting his political adversary, when you and I both know the truth, as Charles Ortel has clearly laid out. The Clinton Foundation is the most corrupt charity fraud in the history of charities.
Yeah, I think they're. I mean, I've written about foundations as well. My next book, I'll talk a lot about the big foundations and how the wealth is hidden in those, and that they're never audited, much as the Federal Reserve's never audited. But the Clinton Foundation seems to be the number one seed there in terms of corruption, much as the Clinton body count. There are body counts for several presidents, but the Clinton body count is the most extensive, the most written about, and continues just to go on and on. I mean, every other week it seems they're connecting a death to the Clintons. Now Hillary Clinton more than Bill Clinton, but there's so many financial shenanigans with the Clinton Foundation, especially what happened in Haiti, where there appears to be allegations of perhaps child trafficking. There was at least one mysterious death connected to that. That's it's just the extent of their corruption. That's why I said when Hillary Clinton was running for president, she's the most corrupt public figure I've ever seen. And I've investigated a lot of them, and there have been an awful lot of corrupt figures. But I think just going back to her Watergate days, when she was fired by a liberal Democrat on the committee because of what she was even doing then. So she doesn't even have very many friends on the left, it seems, in many cases because of her personality. But and obviously Bill Clinton is just a good old boy who his crimes again go back to as the governor of Arkansas and connecting into the JFK assassination. I think I was the first one to illustrate this in my book, where a very strange cosmic coincidence was that Hale Boggs, a member of the Warren Commission, he was the closest thing they had to a dissenting member, and he disappeared on a flight to Alaska back in early 1970s, I guess, something like that. But Bill Clinton, a very young Bill Clinton, was the man who somehow was in a position to drive Hale Boggs to the airport for his flight to oblivion. So even then, he seemed to have a kind of a grim reaper death touch, where things he touched died. But I mean, it's kind of a strange coincidence. But he goes back that far, and then obviously his the crimes in Mena, Arkansas, which most of what I talk about in the Clinton chapter goes back to Arkansas, because they had so many deaths there, and the boys on the tracks. And I've been fortunate to become friends with the mother of one of the boys who is still fighting for justice in that, where they lied. And when you talk to these people, you realize how deep these crimes are, because these are just normal, average people who weren't even politically awake, or not even didn't care about politics. Most people don't care about politics, but obviously her and everyone else was smeared as like trying to get the Clintons. And she said, I didn't feel one way or another about Bill Clinton until, but when you lose your loved one, you care very deeply, and you see that corruption firsthand.
Yeah, you mentioned the boys on the tracks. Folks should know, you can Google that. That's Kevin Ives and Don Henry, and they were
Yes.
murdered. It's believed they stumbled upon the Mena, Arkansas CIA drug running,
Yeah.
and they were laid down on tracks, and they were decapitated, I believe. And
Yes.
yeah, it's just another two bodies added to the very long list of those on the Clinton body count, all of which lead back to the same medical examiner that was appointed by Bill Clinton, who
Yeah.
wasn't even a doctor. I don't even believe he was a licensed medical examiner, if memory serves. But the point is that every single time there was a mysterious murder in Mena, it went to that medical examiner, and it was almost always ruled a suicide or death by natural causes. Didn't matter if those bodies were found with their hands tied behind their backs and two taps to the back of the head with a 9mm.
Yeah, exactly. And Dr. Fahmy Malik, boy, yeah, I go into it quite a bit in the book about there were actually a public outcry from people, because he had so many controversial cases where he had just made rulings that were just completely ridiculous. And Governor Bill Clinton responded to that by giving him a raise and keeping him on. He had a personal stake in that, because another thing people don't realize about the Clintons is that his mother was an anesthesia nurse, and she was sued, I believe, for at least two deaths. She was basically pretty incompetent and made sloppy mistakes, and Dr. Fahmy Malik was there to help in that as well. And so Bill Clinton, I guess, was maybe repaying a personal favor that Malik had helped to protect his own mother and her dereliction of duty.
Let's stay with current news here. You'll recall I recently interviewed John Barber. Thanks to you, actually. You got John in
Yes.
touch with me, and that was a terrific interview. He's an American treasure, and in that interview, we basically made the point that these are the same powers, these deep state powers we're seeing rally the troops and rally their mockingbird mainstream media apparatus to try to target and topple our sitting president, are the same deep state powers, essentially, that killed John F. Kennedy. And the point I want to make here as we come full circle, now we see the mockingbird mainstream media come out with this narrative, and I find it very interesting, because keep in mind that zero hedge item I just shared about the Clinton Foundation investigation by Huber. The narrative now from the mainstream media is Trump wanted to order Justice Department to prosecute Comey and Clinton, but was warned he'd be impeached. So I just think it's fascinating that now they're forced to say that this president did want to go and target those criminals. But here's present tense news, actual news that's happening. House GOP working with whistleblowers in Clinton Foundation probe. I'll read this for you guys. House representatives will hear testimony on December 5th from the prosecutor, that's Huber, appointed by Attorney General Jeff Sessions to investigate allegations of wrongdoing by the Clinton Foundation, according to Representative Mark Meadows. Mr. John Huber with the Department of Justice and the FBI has been having an investigation. At least part of his task was to look at the Clinton Foundation and what may or may not have happened as it relates to improper activity with that charitable foundation. So we've set a hearing for December 5th, Meadows told The Hill. I think this is big news, Donald, as we consider all of those sealed indictments and the Q predictions that they have it all. The powers that be, the white hats, have it all, and sooner or later we will see some big names fall. I want to see these sealed indictments get unsealed, and I'd sure like to see some perp walks. You think we'll ever see that as it pertains to the Clintons?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think there would be nothing more satisfying to awake Americans anyhow to see that the Clintons take that perp walk, because they kind of represent, I think, they epitomize how corrupt the deep state is, and the fact that they're so in your face with their corruption. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. I mean, Hillary Clinton just kind of cackles like a witch sometimes when she's, someone's, leveling the latest accusation at her. We saying we came, we saw, he died, that kind of thing, where she just doesn't seem to. What was it recently where she was caught saying that all blacks look alike, and it kind of. Of course, she can claim she was joking, but we know what would have happened if Donald Trump had said something like that. He probably would have been impeached for that. I mean, that's how ridiculous our society has become at this point. But yeah, for her, it was just a minor blip, and really it didn't make any waves whatsoever. And she really is. We called Bill Clinton the Teflon president back then, and the Clintons both are completely Teflon now. Whether someone can bring them down, boy, I certainly hope so. But I think at this point, I'm not sure what's happening with Trump, but he certainly has the same kind of enemies as John Barber indicated in the previous show. He is besieged, much as JFK was. JFK was trying to do different types of things, but he was going against this awful systemic corruption that is everywhere. And any attempts Trump makes to even go a little, we're talking about, immigration is one huge cog of it. Just attempt even suggesting defending the borders. I understand it. General Mattis and I think some other general just basically vetoed him, which I don't know how that can happen. How can you veto the commander in chief? But I know that Jeff Rentz is one guy who's been talking a lot about that on his show and his guests. So, Trump is in charge as much as any president has been since JFK. But unfortunately, we found with JFK that a president that tries to do good is unfortunately going to be very difficult for him to be successful. So I hope Trump is more successful than that. And certainly we live in different times now, because we have shows like this, which didn't exist back in 1963. The internet didn't exist. So when someone was killed, when MLK, RFK, or JFK Jr., or whatever, when they were killed, there really wasn't this kind of forum for people to doubt it and point out, well, look what if something happened to Trump, these shows would all be abuzz. The world of alternative media would be talking about nothing else. So I think it's a little more difficult to just eliminate someone like that. But they certainly have done such a job of smearing him, at least in the minds of some of the public, that they may think they don't have to go that far.
Yeah, I think we're very blessed to have human intel and patriotic reporters and investigative journalists these days. In 1963, we had gatekeepers like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather. I mean, that's what the people had. And then, of course, the Mockingbird mainstream media, CIA-controlled newspapers, the CIA always liked to brag that through Operation Mockingbird, it could disseminate any headline it wanted all across the country within 24 hours. And those types of false narratives do not hold up nearly as well today, as now the mainstream Mockingbird media's credibility is in the toilet. let's continue with some good news about the investigation of the Clintons. I sure hope, Donald, that in this December 5th hearing, Charles Ortel is invited to speak about the forensic accounting investigation he's done regarding the Clinton Foundation and their inability to file any of the appropriate paperwork as required for a foundation and or a charity. According to a report by the Dallas Observer last November, the Clinton Foundation has been under investigation by the IRS since July 2016. Meadows says it's time for Huber to update Congress. Additionally, Meadows said that his committee is trying to secure testimonies from whistleblowers who can provide more information about potential wrongdoing surrounding the Clinton Foundation. And I'll quote him. He says, "We are just now starting to work with a couple of whistleblowers that would indicate that there is a great probability of significant improper activity that's happening in and around the Clinton Foundation," end quote. This is very big news. And again, if they were just to hear from Charles Ortel, who could provide the hearing members the context and the forensic data that shows exactly just the accounting crimes the Clinton Foundation is guilty of, it would be a sea change. This is something they cannot extricate themselves from if we have rule of law. And that's according to Charles Ortel. That's not puffery from me. They've committed hardcore crimes for which others who have committed far less serious crimes have gone to prison.
No, absolutely. But I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head by saying if we have the rule of law. At this point, I'm not sure that we have the rule of law. And certainly anyone who's dealt with our legal system understands, I call it our injustice system. There are double standards everywhere. You have to rely on whatever whim or the political biases of a particular judge. And often the ignorance of a particular jury, and in fact, juries don't even realize the rights that they have. They have to have the rights to view the law. If the law is unjust, they don't have to go abide by it. But most people, even though you have citizen jurors handbooks and so forth, most jurors don't understand that. Or if they do, they're weeded out before. If they express any kind of intelligence about the process, they usually don't get on juries. So we have such a system that it is so biased, and especially in our left-right paradigm system, ever since Trump was elected, this two-party system is solidified now, because most of the awake people have rallied behind Trump, and the Republicans, as bad as most of them are, because really I see Trump and then the rest of them. I mean, there are very few Republicans that have rallied behind Trump as well. They're still kind of in their neocon world. And then you have the other side who's just completely lost his head. The Democrats are just, I mean, when you can sit there and concentrate on things like 57 genders and things like that, you've lost half the country right there. So we're locked in this left-right system, and we're dependent upon a system of justice where probably half, I don't know how many judges were appointed by Democrats or by this kind of identity politics agenda, but certainly a significant number are. So when you enter a courtroom, if you get one of those kind of judges, are you going to get any kind of justice? I don't know. I doubt it.
You make a great point, but we know that this president is trying to clean that up. And Q has said, how do you clean the deep state house when the judiciary is packed with people that would protect the deep state? And this president is trying to clean house there. I want to share some more good news with y'all. You mentioned the absolute Marxist, full tilt, crazy platform of the far left at this point. I think as exemplified by people like Don Lemon on CNN, who says, all white men are the problem. It's white men that are the real danger. When those of us who are awake understand that what he's really saying is that anybody who is patriotic and cares about a sovereign nation is the problem, they're trying to pin it on white men, completely ignoring people like our buddy Black Conservative Patriot and so many others, different races, colors, and creeds, who are now fleeing the left in droves and coming over to the patriotic side, which is the side Trump represents. Trump is calling himself a nationalist, and that is the dirty N-word the deep state hates.
Yes. Yeah, just by him saying that. So I'm saying Trump, just by Trump's comments, I mean, understand, JFK certainly made some very powerful speeches. The American University speech where he talked about peace, and really the last president until you have snippets of it here or there with Trump. But in between JFK and Trump, no president talked about peace in those terms. I mean, they basically went with whatever the military industrial complex ordered them to do. Send troops here, send troops there. Trump has actually uttered those kinds of things. Now then he goes and bombs Syria. So he obviously has people pressuring him constantly to do that. But you can see he's mentioned this nationalist thing just by saying he's a nationalist. That's not even doing anything. But the very concept that a president of the United States would say, I'm a nationalist, I want a sovereign nation. I may send military troops to the border, which is one of the few really practical reasons, constitutional reasons, really, for a military to exist. If you're not going to defend your own border, we're in 160 countries around the world doing God knows what, some from World War II, and Trump has mentioned that before as well. I wish he would bring them home, or at least attempt to, or make the point that we need to defend our own borders rather than stay in these other countries. But just by him raising that issue, you can see how the vitriol and the hatred against him was increased yet again. So imagine if he could actually get some kind of, like, he got a legislation to audit the Fed or something passed. I can't imagine the kind of hatred that will be out there against him, because so far it's been based the hatred against him has been based mostly on his comments, where in JFK's case, you had the executive order talking about perhaps issuing greenbacks. You had the behind-the-scenes shenanigans with the CIA, where he was thinking of abolishing the CIA in 1963. So there were more, and he also had a coterie of advisors around him. Certainly Bobby Kennedy he could trust. Trump doesn't have a Bobby Kennedy. He needs somebody like that so he can have somebody there with him to trust. And JFK was basically put Bobby Kennedy in charge of intelligence and superseded the CIA. And obviously that just ruffled so many feathers and infuriated them. I don't know who Trump's Bobby Kennedy is at this point. I think he's still pretty much, he may have these people behind the scenes that Q talks about, but as far as we can see in the open, he seems to be a lone wolf.
Well, we're going to circle back here with some more Clinton punishment good news, hopefully here. But you mentioned the word vitriol when Trump said that he's a proud nationalist, and all he meant by that was that he puts America first. That vitriol was not just domestic, it was global. And we saw even Macron come out against him and try to say that nationalism somehow extinguishes patriotism and that nationalism is a dirty word. And he tried to somehow conflate patriotism with globalism in the EU, and it's not working. These people have nothing left to sell, because anybody who really understands the big picture and who's paying attention understands that their words are completely hollow. And Macron is merely parroting what George Soros has to say, which of course was a big Clinton donor, George Soros. So we'll come full circle here. And the good news is Hillary is not in the White House and can no longer stack the deck. And Donald, you might remember that, I think, excellent photo, should be a Pulitzer Prize winning photo of Hillary and Bill Clinton standing in the hallway looking very dejected and depressed at Trump's inauguration before they went outdoors. And every time I see that photo, which I'll put up here, it just reminds me of what we heard she said as she thought she was beginning to lose the election. And she said, if that son of a bitch wins, our heads are going to roll. We'll all hang. Anyway, so get this. The Clinton Foundation is also under FBI investigation out of the Arkansas field office. Boy, that's sort of ironic, huh? The Arkansas field office. Maybe Bill no longer can control what goes on in Arkansas either. It says, launched in January, the Arkansas FBI probe is focused on pay-for-play schemes and tax code violations, according to The Hill. Officials who spoke on condition of anonymity said the probe is examining whether the Clintons promised or performed any policy favors in return for largesse to their charitable efforts, or whether donors made commitments of donations in hopes of securing government outcomes. The probe may also examine whether any tax-exempt assets were converted for personal or political use, and whether the foundation complied with applicable tax laws, officials said. And according to Charles Ortel, they do not. The witness, who was interviewed by Little Rock FBI agents, said the questions focused on, quote, government decisions and discussions of donations to Clinton entities during the time Hillary Clinton led President Obama's State Department, end quote. This seems to be a very serious investigation, and I have a hard time believing they're going to be able to extricate themselves from at least minimal charges here, felony charges.
Well, I'm rooting for that. Like I said, nothing. I think even as I've said before, even as a symbolic gesture, that, to see people like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton actually be held responsible for their criminal actions, and to actually experience the kind of justice that the average common riffraff does out there, would be symbolically, it would make people believe, okay, maybe believe a little bit more in the system, and believe that, okay, maybe there is some kind of justice out there. But the fact that they continue to skate over and over again, when everybody, I said, I can't think of anybody walking around that looked, that I called her the queen of corruption when she was running for president. So I certainly hope so. I mean, we have to hope that, because right now we're locked in a battle, I think, between it seems kind of cliche to say good and evil, but there really is, at this point, Trump is representing what's left, I think, of traditional America, which all its flaws. It certainly had a lot. I'm fond of saying that, we always had corruption. In my next book, I'll show that, because it's pre-1963 corruption. But you had competence back then, and the corruption wasn't quite as deep. For instance, the roads got plowed, the power didn't go off with a strong wind, that kind of thing. So the trains ran on time, to use the old Mussolini analogy. But there was competence, even though there was corruption, and the corruption wasn't so in your face. Once we had politicians of the nature of Bill Clinton and later Barack Obama, where the corruption was so obvious. I mean, it was unthinkable that a politician 50 years ago like Barack Obama would have at least 5 different Social Security numbers, which he did. And yet, to question that, they smear you as a birther. And that was one of the things that Donald Trump first got in trouble about, because he did note that there were questions around his birth. But we can't even talk about that now, because they shout you down, and that's what the left does at this point. It's all about name calling and labeling and killing the messenger, and as much as what happened with Gary Webb, who also wrote about Hidden History that they made a film about. But the corruption is so deep, so deep. So Trump has a monumental task, and you're right to mention the court system, because that seems to be the greatest hope that maybe he can overturn the injustice system by getting enough good judges out there. Because certainly we know there's so many rotten ones right out there right now, and you walk into a courtroom with those judges, and it's like, nothing good is going to happen unless you have a lot of money and it can actually afford some kind of dream legal team.
Yeah. You mentioned Gary Webb, a great journalist who helped shine light of truth on the CIA drug running in MENA. And of course, they whacked him for it. So
shot himself twice in the head.
Yeah, right. And in chapter 6, the Clinton years, Conspiracy Central, you guys got to go get this book, Hidden History. Ruby Ridge, you talk about in this chapter, the Vince Foster case, Waco, the death of Ron Brown, Janet Reno, more on the Clinton body count, the Oklahoma City bombing, folks, just another false flag used against the people. TWA Flight 800 and the Clinton body count marches on. And I tell you, the other chapter that I think would really resonate with people here is chapter 12, the Franklin cover-up child sex scandals, death of William Colby, Satanist military connections, the McMartin preschool scandal, the Finders, Child Protective Services, and more. And the reason I mention that is because you know that John Podesta was so closely tied to the Clintons all those years and managed her campaign in this last election. And it was in 2011 that Andrew Breitbart, previous to his death, called John Podesta a world-class underage sex slave op cover-upper defending unspeakable dregs. And that was before any of us had ever heard of Pizzagate or really Pedogate. But chapter 12 really outlines Pedogate in all its horrors long before that tweet was ever sent out by Andrew Breitbart.
Yeah, that's with what has come with Pizzagate and just what we hear constantly now about the child sex scandals. I think that's probably was the most difficult chapter to write, and it's the hardest when you're trying to wake people up. That I found, at least, is the hardest to try to get through to people, because people, they don't want to believe. The problem with trying to expose corruption anywhere to this level is that people don't want to admit that something that big could be going on, that they've been fooled. As Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool someone than to get them to understand they've been fooled. And this is the problem. They don't. And so something like this, to believe that their leaders, some of whom they like and have voted for, are having sex with children, when the evidence is overwhelming that really from all walks of life, from entertainment, corporate leaders, whatever, when you reach a certain level, and none of us can understand it, but I certainly can't understand it, but that's their go-to move. They go to the having sex with children. And I think that's why you see so many of them in Congress that are either gay or have these pedophile yearnings, because that makes them so very blackmailable. And I think that's why I think it's, against all the odds that so many people, public representatives, would be elected that have these kind of sexual skeletons in their closet. But if you go by the view that they're being selected rather than elected, there are forces behind the scenes that are promoting them because they're going to do their will, and they're going to listen, they're going to vote the way they're told to vote, then you can understand, well, if they get out of line, they can easily just expose this story. Well, you like to have sex with little kids, and their political career's over. But to get people, and certainly the Pizzagate thing we saw, I mean, I still stand firm on Pizzagate. I still think something was strange was going on in that place. And those photos that were posted on Instagram are disturbing, at the very least. But even in the conspiracy world now, a lot of them, Alex Jones, famously apologized for it. And I understand the guy's very litigious, Alefantis, but you have to stand up and say, look, I don't know what's going on there, but it's very disturbing to find a picture of a little girl duct taped to a table there and have somebody joking about a big room and calling it a kill room. Something weird was going on there, especially when connected with all the other world. You talked about William Colby. This is the CIA director who helped John DeCamp, the state senator of Nebraska, who wrote the Franklin cover-up and first exposed the ties to Boys Town and places like that into a Larry King, not the Larry King that hosted CNN Live, but a very big black Republican Larry King.
Yeah, tied to snuff films and all sorts of absolutely dastardly stuff. He comes up specifically named by Bonacci, I believe, who referred to a snuff film that was being, quote unquote, directed by Hunter Thompson. And I just recently played a clip. Again, I did a micro documentary about this. Hunter S. Thompson going on Late Night with David Letterman and saying, "I like to kill." And then literally saying, when challenged by Letterman on that, he says, "We don't want to talk about hunting people on TV, do we?"
You ever hike up into the mountains?
Oh yeah, I do that I like to kill.
And when you say kill, you're talking about what, neighbors? What?
We don't want to talk about shooting people, do we?
No, but you're teasing when you say you like to kill, right?
Yeah. No, I'm not teasing. No, I used to like to kill. When I realized that I was hunting in order to kill.
You like hunting?
I quit. Well, I did. I quit.
Yeah. But I know that when you...
But I quit because I realized I was not hunting for meat. I was hunting because I like to kill.
Yeah.
So these things slip out because these people are so diabolical. Sometimes I think they actually lose their minds. Maybe it's Kuru related. But honestly, yeah, this Larry King and this whole cover-up of the pedophilia going on and the child sex trafficking, that goes straight, that reaches all the way up to satanic ritual abuse levels. I mean, the sick stuff that was going on there.
Yeah, I mean, and I talked about the guy. That's I believe he's still out there. I think he's still alive. I think he's Colonel Michael Aquino, that is associated. That is a colonel in the I think Air Force, and he was defended against. He had not only as an open Satanist, which I'm not sure how you could become a colonel in the Air Force being an open Satanist, but he's tied to a lot of these things. His aides were. And the military continued to defend him. We saw what happened in the Martin preschool scandal when I wrote about that. Clearly they discovered the tunnels that the kids were talking about years later, and it made barely a blip in the media, which was overtly on the side of the teachers. They were not on the, even though I think it was something like 90%, or I have the figures in the book. I don't have of the children. These are preschoolers, had evidence of sexual trauma. Their medical personnel admitted that. So they had this kind of evidence. So, what are preschoolers doing? 90% of them having evidence of something had been done to them sexually. You're not supposed to be active sexually in preschool, and they're coming up with these tales about these strange things going on. I don't know how much more clear-cut proof you need than that, but obviously there's something very big there, and there's a reason why the media, who constantly talk about loving the children,
I know,
that kind of rhetoric where they don't seem to care when they're being abused sexually by powerful people.
It's the same exact thing we saw in the Hampstead cover-up with Ella Draper and her children. These children had the most horrifying firsthand testimony about what was done to them, using words and language, sexual language, that little kids like that would never in a million years know, talking about being anally raped, medical evidence showing that, yes, they had injuries to their anuses, and the mother goes public and is immediately demonized by the UK Mockingbird mainstream media, drummed out of the country because they're going to arrest her. Her boyfriend, the father of the children, gets to go on their version of 60 Minutes, essentially, and do a character repair appearance, is asked no hard questions, and is ultimately given custody of the children. And now, do you know this? He's resurfaced in the United States in an eBay commercial with these children behind him. Now, you can't make that up. I've been meaning to make a micro documentary about this because I think it's so sick and twisted. Think about the symbology of that. The alleged abuser of Ella Draper's children is given the children are given back to him. He resurfaces in the United States under a different name in an eBay commercial, the world's largest auction site. Now, when you think about child trafficking and satanic ritual abuse and the buying and selling of children, is there anything more nefarious than that, appearing in an eBay commercial?
There's not, but, William Colby and I have the whole statement that John DeCamp, who just died, I think, last year. So it's amazing he wasn't knocked off earlier. He could have easily been a prominent member of the Clinton body count with what he was exposing. But William Colby, who became friendly with him, William Colby was the closest thing to a high-ranking CIA official who showed some signs of remorse, I think, and tried to actually kind of go in a different direction. He tried some minor reforms in the CIA when he was there. But he was very close to DeCamp, and he told him, he said, John, you got to understand, no matter how passionate you feel, how right you are about this, when you're going up against the forces like this, you got to understand how dangerous that is. And, Colby died in a very fitting way for a CIA director when he had a very strange canoeing accident. And I have all the details in the book there, but it was, these are the kind of way these people tend to die. They don't tend to die like the way that most people do conventionally. They have these strange accidents like that. And considering what he was working with at the time with John DeCamp, I think it's very telling.
Well, let's do this. We'll just change gears here and come a little bit full circle here on the anniversary of the murder by the deep state of John F. Kennedy. His son also, I believe, was assassinated in 1999. You have a chapter about it, Chapter 7, The Death of John F. Kennedy, Jr. And I want your thoughts about this. We don't have to get into the Q conspiracies. There's some within the Q community that believe John F. Kennedy Jr. is still alive. I don't subscribe to that theory. I remember very vividly when John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. And, of course, through the lens of time, it becomes very clear to me, at least, that I believe that that was an assassination. And, when his plane went down, I thought, well, there goes another one. Right? Yeah. Throughout my whole life, there goes another one. If it's not John F. Kennedy himself, which predates my birth, it's Martin Luther King, or it's John Lennon, or it's JFK Jr. I mean, they just always seem to take out the best people, right? They all seem to take out the truth tellers and anybody that would give humanity a hope. So I guess to that extent, I'm shocked that President Trump is still alive and kicking, and God bless him for, trying to do his best part to defeat the deep state.
Well, JFK Jr. was important in several respects, and I conducted the first independent investigation for my book. I talked to people that were there. I talked to JFK Jr. insiders who wanted to remain anonymous still, or still fearful. John F. Kennedy. What I found was that John F. Kennedy Jr. had a desire behind the scenes, and it was becoming more open. He had a quest to find out who killed his father, and that differentiated him from every other member of the Kennedy family. Certainly his sister Caroline, who freaks out if somebody even mentions the assassination 55 years later. But John F. Kennedy Jr. wanted to know. He had almost like a Hamlet-type Shakespearean compulsion to avenge his father's death. And his magazine George was about to go into that area. Wayne Madsen, a very well-known alternative journalist, told me in an email, admitted that he was set to meet with John F. Kennedy Jr. the week after he died, to become a new investigative journalist on the staff of George magazine to investigate specifically the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So just imagine the ramifications that would have had, because obviously the media couldn't ignore George magazine. They talked it up when he was the sexiest man alive and so forth. So clearly he was on a quest to do that. Now I go over the details of the alleged accident, and there's no question that the official story, as all official stories turn out to be, is just completely fake and phony, more fake news. The 9:39 p.m. phone call, we're told that his plane went into a death spiral at exactly 9:39 p.m. I have unedited coverage that was sent to me by another researcher in Texas, Scott Myers, who recorded it live from WCVB TV local in Boston. And I have hours of that coverage. It was unedited. Later, researchers attempted to find that kind of local coverage, and they edited all references to the 9:39 p.m. phone call out because it's significant. They talked over and over again. UPI reported, ABC News reported it, that JFK Jr. contacted Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9:39 p.m., the exact moment we're told later that his plane was going into a death spiral, saying all was calm, everything was fine. He was planning to drop off his sister-in-law at Martha's Vineyard Airport and then go on to Hyannisport for the wedding of Rory Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's youngest child, with his wife. So clearly, and then what's most important is that the Coast Guard sent a spokesman, a publicity officer, Todd Bergen, to do an interview. And I have that interview on tape. It was done with Susan Warnick, who was a local journalist there. He went into detail talking again about that 9:39 p.m. phone call. Now later, when the Pentagon took over, when the bodies were found and the Pentagon took over, suddenly the 9:39 p.m. phone call went down the memory hole. All references to it were deleted. Suddenly, there was no contact from JFK Jr. anymore. I tried to locate Todd Bergen, found his phone number, left a message for him. He never got back to me. I emailed Susan Warnick, the reporter that interviewed him, 3 different times. Said, what did you think of this? You did an interview with this guy, and as typical journalists, they know to cover up, they know to clam up, they have no investigative zeal whatsoever. She should have been chomping at the bit. Hey, wait a minute, what is the Coast Guard doing sending a guy out here to talk about a phone call that never happened?
Let me just tell you, I want to just jump in and remind people how we see this happen time and time again with these mockingbird mainstream media journalists. It just reminds me of Jane Stanley, who was reporting live from New York City with the BBC via satellite about the collapse of the Solomon Brothers building as World Trade Center 7 was still standing behind her. And while she was having that conversation via satellite, the satellite feed fails. And 20 minutes later, the building about which she was just speaking, saying it had already collapsed, then collapses at free fall speed. And of course, Jane Stanley doesn't want to talk about that now.
Because they can't. You see this in all these cases. But Steve Zabraka, who was the first local reporter on the scene, who also worked at that time for WCV TV, he shocked me because I emailed him without really giving away that I had any doubts about the official story, and he must have seen through it because he said, to be honest with you, nothing seemed right about that case. Something was wrong there. There were so many people on the scene, and I exchanged emails. Again, they're in the book. And he's very significant because he talked to a local reporter from the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, who early on there were reports in the media that a local reporter, they never named him, had seen an explosion in the sky. Again, at that time in that area, so clearly it had to do with JFK Jr.'s plane. And he was never identified. Steve Zabraka said, I will swear in court that this guy existed. He gave me a description of him. I tried emailing the editor of the Martha's Vineyard Gazette. They claim to not even remember the story. Now, the Martha's Vineyard Gazette is a little, very tiny newspaper that gears to a local community. That's probably the biggest story they ever had in their existence. There's no way she doesn't remember that. So very frustrating, but that's the kind of the problems that we face in investigating something like this, that we have, the reports change so much. I exchanged emails with Edward Meyer, who wrote the weather reports, the official weather conditions for the FAA. He was mad at the time. He lashed out at the media and said, you guys are not telling the truth about anything, because what happened was the radar and people like Edward Meyer who actually investigated it showed that the weather conditions at the time were not bad at all. We kept hearing it was hazy, JFK Jr. was reckless, he should have never flown. That's all bull. That's contradicted by the actual evidence. And this guy was still mad when he emailed. He said nothing, and the readers can see the exact quote that I quote him in there, nothing reported by the American media by this was accurate at all.
I want to weigh in just with a little bit of memory here, and you tell me if I have this correct. I recall this time so very well, and I recall the Mockingbird mainstream media really turning against JFK Jr. immediately and trying to disparage him as a reckless, inexperienced pilot flying at night, wasn't rated to be flying at night. And my understanding is that he was a very competent pilot, a very careful pilot, who almost always flew with a flight instructor, especially if he was going to fly at night. And then I recall some news bits about the possibility, and this gets a little gruesome, about divers locating the plane and the possibility of there having been a flight instructor on board that plane. Of course, the Mockingbird mainstream media tried to make it sound like there was no flight instructor. And then there's this whole theory that Bush Sr. was involved in the murder of John F. Kennedy, and Bush Jr. was involved in the murder of JFK Jr. I wonder if there's any truth in any of that.
Well, their early reports indicated that there was a fourth seat missing from the plane, and there were reports that there was a flight instructor on board. JFK did usually fly with a flight instructor. One of his flight instructors told the Orlando Sentinel he was again mad, and he kind of backed off later. But he said, no, this guy was a very qualified pilot. He was good. This was a flight easy for him to make. It was not difficult, but he kind of backed off. But he did appear in the Orlando Sentinel earlier on, and as for the Bush connections, John Hankey, there's a very good documentary out there called, I think it's The Assassination of John F. Kennedy Jr. I can't remember what the exact title is. Probably still out on YouTube. Hankey's done some good work. It's very entertaining, but I think he concentrates a little bit too much on Bush, much as I think the people that supposedly saw a picture of George H.W. Bush, who would have been very young at the time in 1963. I don't doubt that he was connected to the CIA, and there's a letter about George Bush to the CIA and so forth. But I think he would have been a very kind of a low-level guy at his age at that time, even though his father was a president and he had some elite connections, I'm sure. He was Yale, Skull and Bones, and so forth. But I think these things are done above the level of politicians, much as the people that say LBJ was behind JFK's assassination. Again, he was a thoroughly corrupt politician. He had a body count probably second only to Clinton's, and he certainly would have approved of it and would have been, and was, I don't think, was delighted that JFK was assassinated so he could achieve his lifetime dream of being president. But I think these decisions are made above those levels. W. Bush, had not been elected yet, was on the verge of getting elected. So certainly he would have had reason, much as Hillary. A lot of people connect JFK Jr. to the Clinton body count because there are indications that he might have challenged her for the Senate seat in New York that she went on to take. So clearly a lot of people, and Hillary, JFK Jr., people forget how this guy had none of the baggage that some of Robert Kennedy's children had. For instance, he had led a clean life. He had movie star looks. He was better looking than his father, for goodness sake. I mean, he just on looks alone, he probably would have gotten 80% of the female vote. And he just had charm. He's all accounts like his father. He was well liked behind the scenes. He just got along with everyone, treated the little people fine. And here, but he had this dangerous thing where he wanted to find out who killed his father. And I think that there was no way they were going to let him live. And as you mentioned, I remember when I first saw the helicopters flying around when he was reported missing, I knew there was no chance of him being found alive, because that's what happens to Kennedys, unfortunately. And it's I detail all their deaths in the book, and there are more unnatural deaths of the Kennedys than people even know. I mean, readers can, in-laws and things like that. It's just amazing and astonishing. It goes to the level of Greek tragedy, if it could possibly be. And I don't really understand, other than there is kind of a blood and water thing, I think, with the people that rule us. Much as they love symbolism, I think they fear, even someone like a Carolyn Kennedy today, who seems about as innocuous a threat as possible. She doesn't seem to have a bone in her body to go against the establishment, but she is the only surviving child of JFK. And I think that's why, for instance, when she was set to be named as the senator from New York to replace Hillary Clinton, they went on a campaign and they said, she said, 150 times or something, stuff that they routinely clean up when they publish these interviews with inarticulate people that are less inarticulate. But she completely dropped out. She got the message, and she won't be heard from again politically. But the JFK Jr., I think, is one of the most important chapters in my book, because until I wrote about it, now another guy recently has written a book about it, I understand, but until I investigated, I think people they had to go by the early 1999 reports. There were some good, and even then, at that time, you had guys like John Quinn of Newshawk and John DiNardo, John Hankey, as I mentioned, Wayne Madsen, Anthony Hilder, but these were all people on the internet. And we saw even then no one in the mainstream media, although we did have things like the Boston Globe that did question the very quick cremation of the Catholic Kennedy and his wife, which was very strange, and the fact that they did a very superficial kind of autopsy, whatever they did. And even the mainstream media questioned that. So very, very strange. aspects to this death. I think because of what we know about what he was thinking behind the scenes and what he was planning to do, I don't think there's any doubt that he was eliminated, much as his father and uncle were.
Let me ask you this before we go, because I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up, because there are some, and among them are actually my friend Liz Crokin, who really has a belief that there's a possibility that JFK Jr. is alive and his death was faked. Now, as with everything as context, everything that we've just talked about, I don't personally think that there's a chance in the world that that could be the case. How do you get one of the world's most famous men to just disappear for the last 20 years? Your thoughts? I mean, I guess it would be one of the most incredible stories in the history of the world if somehow JFK Jr. is tied to this Q white hats movement, and we're going to take this thing back, and we're going to, we're going to take this thing back for the Republic and the people. But we do need to keep in mind that during the president's inauguration, he did say, this is not just merely an exchange of power from one political party to another.
But we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
So I do believe the white knight efforts are real. I just don't personally believe JFK Jr. is involved. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, boy, that would give it such a Hollywood Frank Capra type twist. I mean, I would love to think that JFK Jr. was behind the scenes trying to help Trump drain the swamp and get rid of the deep state. But as you mentioned, yeah, it would be very far-fetched, I think, to believe that something like that could, although, but again, knowing what we know of how these cover-ups work, I would hesitate to say impossible, because one thing we do know, just what I know from investigating, is the official story is impossible. So I know that he didn't die because of an accident. Now, it looks on the surface certainly that he did die, but again, we have to trust the people that found the bodies. We never, we didn't see, there were no footage of that really. The bodies were quickly cremated at sea, which is very, very strange. And they had the establishment media I talked about that were on hand to provide absurd explanations for that, like that. Well, the family didn't want him to have a grave site that would become a fodder for ghouls to desecrate. And as I mentioned, JFK's and RFK's graves have never been desecrated by ghouls. There was no reason for them to think that. But again, it seemed to be a very convenient, tailor-made excuse as to why. So I think the only indication that could possibly have any validity that he faked his own death would be the way that they kept the public away from even seeing the retrieval of the bodies and the wreckage, and the way they cremated and got rid of them so quickly. I find that, but again, that I think that's more likely that it's just part of the assassination process, and they just wanted to get rid of the evidence real quickly, as they're wont to do. But I'm familiar with those theories, and I'd like to think they were true, because the guy was 38 years old. And it's just an awful tragedy. He didn't even live as long as his uncle or his father. And he had such a bright future. And I think that the world would have been vastly different because I think it would have been a completely different Democratic Party, I think, with somebody like him in there.
Boy, it sure absolutely would have been. He's the antithesis to Hillary Clinton. And they're both considered Democrats, but she's a Soros Marxist Democrat, and he was his father's type of Democrat, right? Democrat for the people. I wonder how the Democratic Party has gone so far off the rails as to allow what's happened to it to have happened, because it is really, really a pathetic shame. But I'll say this, it's interesting you leave the door open on that, because boy, wouldn't it be wonderful to find out that, yes, even back then there were some white knights in the military that wanted to try to preserve the republic, and they knew that sooner or later the deep state would take a hit out, would whack JFK Jr. So they made sure to put in protective measures to prevent that from happening. Boy, you're right. That would be a Hollywood story for all ages, wouldn't it? The best movie ever.
It's a Wonderful Life. Boy, it would be such a feel-good story, and it would give hope. But again, I don't think it's very likely. But the average person out there who isn't awake thinks everything we're talking about is unlikely and impossible. So and we know that obviously that these these huge cover-ups can be instituted, and these things can happen. Witnesses can be killed constantly. I mean, you can read of. I mean, just during Hillary Clinton's candidacy, the amount of people that died, the guy that dropped the barbell on his throat while he was working out. I mean, another guy that dropped dead of a heart attack after he served the papers about the DNC. rigging the
Yeah.
primaries, dropped dead at 39 or something.
Sean Lucas, I believe, was his name. Is that right, Sean Lucas? But the other death that comes to mind is Scalia. And what did the deep
Well, there
state
you
do? Immediately got his body,
No autopsy.
cremated his body, no autopsy.
Yep.
Yeah,
Another
no,
Catholic, yeah.
it's always fishy around the deaths of these people who, are opposed in any way, shape, or form to the Marxist Democratic Party or the deep state. All right, so I'm glad I mentioned Scalia. I meant to mention that. I thought there was something else I wanted to mention, but we've covered a lot of stuff here. Why don't you tell people about the book, how to get it? It's called Hidden History, and it would be a very, very good Christmas present for folks to hand out to their loved ones.
Well, I hope so. It's done very well. It was the bestseller. It was #1 a couple times in several different categories on Amazon. The paperback edition has a foreword by Roger Stone, and but it also has blurbs by Cindy Sheehan on the left and Cynthia McKinney on the left. So it's a very unbiased look, I think, at every administration and the years since 1963. I cover. You mentioned a lot of the subjects in there. I didn't leave too much out. I realized I might have left a few things out later, but I covered as much as I could, every significant political event. And people have told me, so many people have told me that it will help to wake them up, because it's nice to have everything in one. It's like the original title was not expose, the subtitle was encyclopedia. And I think that really is fitting, because it's you can begin it anywhere. People have told me, that you can begin at the chapter on JFK Jr. or Oklahoma City, whatever you want. You can work back. You can go, because it does read like an encyclopedia. I analyze each event. I try to tell the true story and the way the narrative changed, and the unnatural deaths that are associated with almost all of these events and have been forgotten. And I focus again and again on, if there's a subtext to the books, it's the failure of our mainstream media in every one of these events to do any kind of investigative reporting. And that's why when we're seeing the way they treat Trump and the way they react to even things like saying I'm a nationalist, or we might want to get rid of illegal aliens or something, illegal immigrants, something like that, it's not anything new for them. They react. They are. I compare them to Pravda and TASS journalists at the height of the Soviet Union, but the difference is the Russians at that time were smart enough to realize they were being lied to, and this is a state agency. Too many Americans don't seem to realize, and they think people like Jim Acosta and people like that, and Don Lemon, that these are actual journalists, that these are not just talking heads for the state, which is what they are. But my book is readily available on Amazon. It was published by Skyhorse Publishing. Courageous Publishers published my third book will be out with them next year, which is going to be called Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776 and 1963. So we'll go over the earlier events. Hopefully we can talk about that now. But in this case, you can find a ton of stuff on the JFK assassination, including my own personal experiences investigating it, all the way through the JFK Jr., all the way through the Obama years. This was before Trump, so Trump is... I don't know if Trump's even mentioned it in history, which is hard to believe. A book was published in 2014 without his name in it, but that's how quickly he catapulted into the political scene, that he really wasn't relevant politically to be talking about at that time. I don't think anybody foresaw him as the president of the United States.
No, they sure didn't, but we are, I think, very lucky. Our cup is at least half full, because the Wicked Witch, the deep state puppet known as Hillary Clinton, is not in the White House, and instead she is being investigated for her hardcore crimes tied to the Clinton Foundation, and that is just scratching the surface. Guys, get the book. It's called Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups in American politics. Oh, and one last thing, Donald. As you know, the CIA is the one that coined the term conspiracy theorist to try to poison the well against anybody who would question the official story of John F. Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah, the infamous 1967 memo that was it talked about the critics of the Warren Report. Yeah, people can, and that's readily available, I believe, online too. I quote from it in Hidden History. People need to look at that and realize this was 1967, and it can apply to, as you noted, beyond the Warren Report, because at that time they were mainly concerned with these critics, these citizen critics. As again, even as with everything else, there wasn't really there were a couple local Dallas reporters like Jim Mars that did good work on it originally. But other than that, no one in the mainstream media investigated the Kennedy assassination. They all poo-pooed this. It was all done by citizen activists. Average people they came from all walks of life, chicken farmers, things like that that World Health Organization workers. These were the people that did all the investigation that the mainstream media didn't. And I think the CIA perhaps didn't know they were foreseeing what would happen in the future with all these other issues. But the language they use in there can be applied to anything when they talk about use, and people have to read it to see. They advise on how, and they talk about using our assets in the media. And we know about Operation Mockingbird, even to today, when you look at people like Anderson Cooper, who admits to being a CIA intern in college, and look at his so-called reporting, and understand that we don't know how many others that have not acknowledged that they were recruited into the CIA during their college days, because the CIA does have a very strong, and always has had a strong, college intern program. How many of these people graduate to the MIDI? I saw some reports, and I don't know the specifics of it, where people were talking about a bunch of Democratic congressmen that were affiliated with the CIA that got elected in the last election. I haven't looked into that, but it doesn't surprise me, and I think that's the reason why all our intelligence agencies still have top secret budgets. So when anybody talks about that, not only do we not know what they're doing in these intelligence agencies often, we don't know how much money they're spending, and as taxpayers, we at least ought to have the right to know what their budgets are.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind, guys, as you think about the Mockingbird mainstream media aligned against us and aligned against truth, CNN pays Anderson Cooper $12 million a year to essentially spew deep state talking points. So as you consider the 55th anniversary of the murder of President John F. Kennedy, today on Thanksgiving, November 22nd, 2018, say a prayer for truth and for justice, and consider Luke chapter 8, verse 17, for there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the light. Our guest has been Donald Jeffries. The book is Hidden History. Thank you so much, Donald.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for your support. God bless you all. God bless your families. And God bless the United States of America and the Constitution. And for real news, check us out at sgtreport.com. Bye-bye.
Somebody in the 1% of the old families that own the country ordered the murder of John Kennedy. And I'm only saying this publicly for the very first time because Jim Garrison told me all of this in confidence. He said it was probably Averell Harriman. He hated John Kennedy and his opposition to the war in Vietnam.